Good morning. This is WIOX, and the show you're listening to is The Other Future. I'm your host, Terry Tapp, and today our guest will be Antero Alli. Let me reintroduce you, especially if you're listening the first time, introduce you to the show. The show initially was born out of an idea of looking for people involved with interesting projects or investigating the projects themselves that have something contrary to present from what we're presented in the media. Not just the media, but the corporate interests that promote our media and want us to believe in the desperate future they're foisting upon us. So I look for people that actually are producing what I call the other future. This was something, if you look back in the 1970s, for instance, if you read about futurologists, psychedelic researchers, artistic visionaries, they thought that we were going to have a future full of space exploration and enhanced bodies, enhanced physical experiences, enhanced consciousness, life extension, intelligence increase, things like this. And obviously, we've gone the other way horribly toward planetary suicide or ecocide. So my guest today, to me, really represents excellently that other future. He spent a lot of time with and was acquainted with, friends with, people who, to me, actively promoted that, this grander, more utopian vision that we used to have that I think we can actually return to. People like Terence McKenna and Robert Anton Wilson and Timothy Leary, among others. So, Antero Alli is an author and filmmaker, but he's also representative of an artistic approach that is very dear to my heart. That is an artistic approach that can't be easily defined or commercialized. Even though we could say author and filmmaker, he's also created plays. He's also been involved with explorations in his art that extend well beyond definable genres. So, without further ado, Antero, are you there? Hello? Antero?
Hello?
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good morning. I appreciate you getting up so early. I know it's much earlier out in Oregon right now.
Yeah, it's like 6 o'clock. It's still dark here, but I'm here.
Excellent. Thank you. Can you just, as a way of introduction, I don't like to spend too much time on this because there's so much we could talk about. Could you say a little about your background?
Okay. My background is in theater, experimental theater, and in particular, the nonverbal communicative mediums of mime theater. And I was trained by a fellow named Keith Berger, a protege of Paul Curtis, the founder of the American Mime Theater there in New York City. And for about 12 years, between 1970 and 1981 or 82, I was teaching, performing, and composing pieces through that medium of mime theater. And that formed the basis for a certain development in what I call paratheater, a term coined by Polish theater director Jerzy Grotowski. And so I've been developing over the last 40 years my own kind of version of a Grotowski-inspired physical theater, combining elements of physical theater, dance, vocalization, and standing no-form meditation as a means to access autonomous forces of energy in the body as movement resources and their expression in action, gesture, and so forth. And that process has inspired quite a few of my films in undergoing some of these paratheatrical experiments. My own awareness has been altered significantly. My nervous system has been impacted in some serious ways, in a good way, but in a way that I have to now live a lot more honestly than maybe I would have if I had not stumbled along these directions. And so the paratheater work has inspired a lot of my filmmaking, and then about 30 years ago, I picked up the language of astrology, which I approach in a very particular way. It's not mainstream astrology at all, but it's become my day job.
Right.
So that's. Yeah,
you're in touch with Bob Bresney, the astrologer, as well, correct?
Yeah, Rob's a good friend. In fact, he and I made a movie together, a movie back in 1995 called The Drive Time, based in some of his concepts of this dimension that gave expression to the overlay between dreamtime realities and daytime realities, a kind of an infinite corridor of images. And the aim of The Drive Time was simply to enter into states of consciousness that stimulate the imagination, and in particular to insurrect the poetic imagination.
Yeah, when we can just pause in respect of that phrase, because I've had people on here quite a bit. So the insurrection of the poetic imagination. I want to back up and talk about some of what you said, because it's a lot, and it's wonderful stuff. I talk to people about gentrification, about what seems to be happening to the arts, which is that they're mainly being made more and more by a tiny class of people, and they're boring. If you go, not all, of course, but if you go to a lot of galleries in the city, in New York City, well, you don't see there's a lot of lack of excitement and a lot of excellent resumes. So I feel like the public space, the imaginative space, the artistic space, all of this is being attacked, and there needs to be, as much as there needs to be a defense politically of the public and the public's interest, there needs to be a defense of the imagination. So to back up for a second, paratheater, a term you get from Gutowski, is really a way of opening up the body. Would that be a way, an entry point into a description of it?
Very much so. The body, as I'm using that term, I view at this point as a kind of personification of the subconscious mind. And so the accessing sources of energy in the body is really a kind of somatic embodiment of what Carl Jung referred to as active imagination, or the process of making the unconscious conscious.
Right.
And so that's been an ongoing paratheatrical research, is the way I kind of refer to it, since 1977. And around, that would have been around 1990, I was turned on to the works of Hakim Bey and his treatise on immediatism. That really kind of touched a nerve for me. And I think I want to kind of backtrack here a little bit as a part of how I got this way, or part of how I became who I am today, whoever that is.
Because I want to talk about immediatism and that influence. That's a very seminal essay for a lot of artists.
Well, I think immediatism, the essence of it is the awareness of how instant gratification in the consumerist culture that promotes instant gratification has really over time, over decades, supplanted and replaced the sense of immediacy. And so what has happened in the culture at large, I think, is that the instant gratification has been confused for the sense of immediacy. And there is no real comparison. They're very different states, different states of being, in a sense.
The mediation, too, of screens and the space between our senses and our emotional life, and that realization, too, I think was part of it. Because he kept talking about, how we get further and further away from an active participation in the world, and more become passive recipients of experience.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And when that happens, we become, in a sense, overwhelmed. Especially in the modern digital media age, we become overwhelmed with images. And when the imagination becomes overwhelmed with images that it did not create itself, it starts suffering a slow death over time. And eventually, what can occur is something I call imaginational lobotomy, where the individual imagination is replaced by the cultural imagination or the advertising imagination or the geniuses that create the gorgeous images that are too overwhelming for the individual imagination to assimilate. And so, when the imagination atrophies, it no longer is capable of creating its own images. And this is part of, I think, the function of a healthy imagination, is this capacity to create its own images that are relatively free of the influence of the corporate image and the corporate patterning of how images are created. One thing I wanted to just kind of add briefly, something personal to me, it might help the listeners to understand. Very early on, I came to the conclusion that my time was more worth than money, and so I've somehow managed never to have a 9-to-5 job. I've been off the grid of the 9-to-5 schedule for all of my adult life. I'm 66 years old, and I've done this through a number of different means. Some of them are legal, some of them are unfit for print, but
sure.
In any case, I've gotten by making an art out of poverty, basically. And in doing so, I've had pretty much complete ownership of my own time, and that has done quite a bit to alleviate survival anxiety. And I have discovered that until survival anxiety is alleviated, it's very difficult to enter into high creative states. And for me, as a person who knows what they're living for, I live basically to serve creation, to stay creative. I knew that I couldn't, live a life that was fraught with survival anxiety. I had to figure out survival, and not just physical survival, but emotional survival, intellectual survival, social survival. So all these, like a hierarchy. There we go. It's early morning.
It's fine.
Of survival needs that I've had to redefine and find ways to meet on my own. And I think that's been a really important responsibility. And the other artists that I speak to, I think can relate to that, is that once you've pretty much redefined the basic premises of your own survival criteria, then pretty much you have that time to create. You're not busy, conforming to the security, status, and social standards and values of the default culture at large.
Yeah, that's very important, because a lot of my own investigation and involvement is political as well as artistic. And I come from Trailer Park, Kentucky, so I didn't have that economic background foundation to provide me leisure time. And I've had to do all types of jobs and been very high on the economic roller coaster and very low at times. And that survival pressure and the pressure of the time demon, that eats up the what's killing you to create, really, that has to get out, has really informed me politically. When I hear someone like you who's been able to, maybe if not defeat it, I don't know what language you'd use for that, but at least contain it, or put some boundaries around it, that, like I said, the time demon. That's beautiful, and I see that as working back and forth with many artists when you struggle with those survival needs and you struggle to create, and it's such a desperate push and pull.
Well, yeah, a big part of it is I realized that I never wanted to make money off of my art, so I always separated art and commerce. I have never had any ambition to bring them together.
Sure. Yeah, that's actually very smart. And I wondered as a kid about that, because I've worked as a welder, a pipe fitter, steel fitter, things like that, and been able to completely, that's not my art. And I've been able to separate them, and it almost feels healthier in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, it has been. I mean, I know it's not for everybody. I know there are individuals that somehow are able to reach a very high level of artistic and commercial success. It's just not in my blood to do that.
Yeah, and that's one thing I actually respect about you and your work is that it appears that you're just moving along an interior path. And as an artist, I know what that feels like. And if I see, I'll put it in my own terms, other artists that are making good money, a lot of the time they make good money repeating the same thing over and over. And I wondered how they do that.
I call that the Wayne Newton syndrome.
Okay.
Wayne Newton, bless his heart, he makes a lot of money doing the same thing over and over again in Las Vegas, but he's kind of like a patron saint to that dilemma, those people that are kind of cycling through the same thing and getting paid. And this is partly why they keep doing it, because they're getting paid to repeat the thing that they do best. And this is actually, I have gotten quite a few professional actors, singers, and dancers coming through the para-theater work with me because they've realized that they're stuck doing the thing that they do well because they got paid for it, and they're looking to kind of undo some of those methods, undo some of those habits. And this is part of the destabilizing influence of para-theater is a kind of an undoing process where we work towards our aims via negativa, so to speak, by stripping away the pretenses, the masks, the identification with self-image, and so forth.
Right. Let me give people who are listening some addresses where they can look at what you do and investigate that further. You can go to verticalpool, POOL.com, and you can also go to paratheatrical.com. That's verticalpool.com and paratheatrical.com. And this is WIOX. You're listening to The Other Future. I'm Terry Tapp, and my host this week is Antero Alli. So let's talk about some of that, because in breaking down the idea of para-theater and what you're doing, I'm reminded of the work of Wilhelm Reich, Alexander Lowen, and I, looking around today, because I'm always looking at what we can use as artists and thinkers to change things. Those approaches seem to be lost now, or at least just not on the map. And I'll say for people listening, Wilhelm Reich was a student of Sigmund Freud. He broke away because he thought that processes like the libido in Freud were actually instantiated in the body, that you could actually see muscular contraction that was the lack of libido or the hardening to prevent a particular flow of creative sexual energy, things like this. And Alexander Lowen was a student that took Reich's work further. But I don't see those. What do you think about that?
I understand that. One of my mentors, a fellow he went by the name of Christopher S. Hyatt, which is a pseudonym. He's no longer with us, but he was a student of protege and of Israel Regarde, who was also worked with Reich personally way back in the early 50s, and the notion of the physical body personifying the subconscious mind, as I mentioned earlier, is exactly what Reich was onto. I think that a big reason why these kinds of body-centered, body-based approaches are disappearing off the map has to do with this acceleration of virtuality that is literally moving towards a place of rendering the body obsolete.
Right.
And so, there's a lot of reasons. It's very complex. I wouldn't even, pretend to go there, as to why people want to leave their bodies, why people, want to disappear into some kind of virtual Valhalla through, internet connection and addiction and so forth. But it's been my experience, like, for example, just on my own personal level with the paratheater work, over the years, about maybe 10% of the population that would discover what I'm doing might be intrigued by it. About 1% would actually go into the reading material and develop their own ideas about it and start getting a conceptual understanding of it.
Right.
About 1% of 1% would actually start participating in the work either with me or on their own. So it's a very narrow band of interest, as what the direction that you suggested, and as well as the work I do. It's not a populist medium. It's an elitist medium, and elitist here doesn't mean that it's like better or worse than anything else. It's just a super narrow range of interest, so that's what I've seen so far.
Well, I brought those up because your paratheater and paratheatrical work and the no form work that you're doing with the standing meditation, basically. As you said, it's the body the body embodies, not to be circular in that way, but the unconscious, basically.
Yes.
And so you're putting people in a different relation to that reservoir of images and the concomitant emotions and just states of being, I guess we would say. So I wonder if you look at things today, and we can go to those complex ways about why people are trying to get rid of their bodies, because I see that as tying in very well with scientific problems, environmental problems, and political problems. But I also wonder, if you break that connection you have with your body, what begins to happen then? Because you're talking about getting in touch with these images, or the unconscious, which in part is reflected in imagery, by getting in touch with your body through paratheatrical work. And I heard in there, and I know from your work too, that that kind of very raw individual connection to the unconscious is, to me, in disdain today. If you look at, for instance, the work or so-called work of Jordan Peterson, okay, I don't know if you're aware of him, but
yeah,
he has a lot of effect on very alienated young men. And very bad effect, actually, because he ties in with the alt-right and a lot of the incel culture and things. But I listened to him, and I heard him making a mistake about his interpretation of Jung and archetypal psychology, in that the imagery that he's pulling forth is very static. It's almost like a book of dream interpretation that he can give you, where he gives you an interpretation of a story, and you now have the key instead of finding an individualized interpretation or transforming those images yourself, as we do as artists. And I feel almost like there's a connection between the violence of these young men that's directed toward innocent people and their inability to transform those images themselves. Does that make any sense?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm aware of the work of J.P. Peterson, and what I get is I think he's more like a moralist dressed up as an intellectual. And if you can understand that, okay, he's coming from a moral place, he's got a particular moral code, and so I think part of the reason why he's appealing to the young is that there is a inclination towards in the culture at large, especially with the loss of sense of immediacy, there's also a loss of a sense of moral compass that comes along with that, and an aimlessness and a directionlessness, and he feeds into that. In fact, he gets rich off of that. He's very clever financially in terms of what he gets for his YouTube channel and his talks and et cetera. And he's tapping into a need, but it's like you said, it's not done in a way that I personally find useful or creative. I think creative might be the better word. It probably is useful in some ways, but it doesn't look creative to me. What was your question?
This is just an open discussion because, like I said, you touch on so many things when you're talking about paratheater, talking about getting in touch with the unconscious through these bodily works and so forth. That alone just motivates 20 questions at least. So I threw that out because, when you're talking about transformation and that very individualized, expansion of the self in a way, or the self's relation to the unconscious. And I hear in these other people that they're not doing that, and that's a very specific thing I picked up on with Peterson. I've talked to young men. I've tattooed in Manhattan for years, and I'm working on people tattooing and talking to them, and young men that have been into him seem to really take from him that there is a dream book they can pick up, and these images, feminine bad, feminine chaos, masculine order, so forth, you can take those and stamp it onto your dreams, the images that well up from you, and it speaks to me of something really treacherous.
Yeah, it can be, and I think that awareness of the treacherous is important. As someone that's come out of the 60s and 70s myself, I'm well aware of the dream logos that came out of the 70s, what you talk about, the utopianism and so forth.
Right.
But I've also come to realize a certain naivete that came out of that decade that is in me, and I've had to somehow expose and get over myself. And there's a naivete to the tragedy of the world, or what I call tragic insight. And this is something that has helped me live with all that has so-called gone wrong with the world. I'm not one to focus on what's gone wrong with the world, because I already know the world has gone wrong, so I don't need to focus on that. And so I don't really see how the tragedy of the world, there's a whole history, centuries and centuries and centuries of warfare and treachery and barbarism, etc., that has really been the foundation of who we are today. It's just acting out in more, let's say, subtle and complicated ways, but people are still killing themselves intellectually, emotionally, morally, financially, professionally, and physically. So I'm seeing that, and finding ways to, let's say, trying not to be too flippant here, but transform tragic into magic. And it's been kind of like a private, code for me. How do I transform tragic into magic? Well, that's got to start within myself. And I've experienced maybe 2 or 3 episodes in my life that I would call truly tragic. And so I've got material to work with, and I've had to, out of those tragedies, those losses, the loss of a child would be, one of the top tragedies that I'm talking about. That actually, for me...
that was your daughter in the 90s.
Say what?
Your daughter, correct.
Yeah, I lost my daughter in 92, and that actually catapulted me into a 22-year era of nonstop filmmaking, because that tragedy, because I chose not to numb down, because I chose not to shut down in the face of all that pain and loss, I decided to open myself up to it and move through it. Well, what happened there was something really surprising, is that it opened up levels of perception and seeing that I was not expecting. And so as a result, I was overwhelmed by what I was seeing around me and seeing through the lies of society and so forth. And I couldn't live with all that I was seeing. I was simply overwhelmed by more perception of reality than I knew what to do with. And so at the time, the only thing I knew what to do, because I had a background of theater, and I knew that theater as a medium wasn't going to be let's say, as complex and as subtle as I needed to give expression to these visions that I was having, that's when I picked up a video camera and started just shooting stuff, and eventually started developing narratives inspired by, this loss, and then that went on to more narratives, and it just kept leapfrogging for, 22 years. And then the last feature I made, 2015, Out of the Woods, I thought, okay, that's my last feature. I'm done. I haven't made a feature since, but it turns out that the muses of cinema have been knocking on my door lately, and so I'm now researching my next film, which I hope to release in 2020.
Where are you releasing these? Are these online? Or are they in small theaters?
Both, and DVD. But recently, I've posted all my films online for free viewing at my website at verticalpool.com. There's a link there that says Films by Antero. But if you go to YouTube or Vimeo and just put my name in there, Antero Alli, A-L-L-I, you should be able to find something there.
Okay. I want to pick some of that because that's really moving. I've had my own set of tragedies, and I've noticed some of that. Nothing as devastating as the loss of a child, but I have noticed the change in dreams and output in sketchbooks and paintings and things that come from that in my own limited sense of the tragedy, which hopefully remains there. But I want to talk about, too, you were talking about immediatism. And immediatism, if you're just joining us, we're beginning to discuss this. Immediatism is a term invented by Hakim Bey. I think he did invent it in an essay in the early 90s, actually. Wasn't that correct? Or late 80s?
Yes.
Okay. And immediatism, it's his vision, ironic vision of an artistic movement that doesn't, that reduces the space experientially between the viewer and the creator, so that both become creative participants in the artistic process. So you're not sitting watching a screen and drinking a beer and letting other people fill yourself with their own visions, which are usually inappropriate for your own self-interest. Maybe that's a decent way of saying it. But say more about that, because I was really inspired by that essay, and I still don't know how to realize anything like that. He talked about zine culture and mail art and things like that, but in today's surveilled culture, and with all these screens everywhere pushing at us, I don't know how to do that.
Well, it remains an ongoing kind of research and process for me on a day-to-day basis that doesn't always end in a product. In fact, it's more a kind of a way of life. And for me, it starts with attention, the sense of immediacy. Restoring the sense of immediacy has to do with what I would call the activation of the second attention. And the first attention is that awareness linked to the thinking machine and the automatic assignment of labels, names, and meanings. And the first attention is typically, I think, the attention that what I think most people would assign, that's what attention is, because I see something, then I call it something, and it means something. And so that's the first attention, involving the automatic assignment of names, labels, and meanings. Second attention is that awareness linked to presence, phenomena, and energy without the assignment of labels or meanings.
Right.
And so there's these two attentions, and ideally they want to be able to work together, because you need the first attention. You need to be able to label stuff, and in order to communicate verbally to other people, that's all first attention. But without the second attention, you miss out on a more direct perception of things as they are before they were labeled, named, or someone assigned a meaning to it. You come into a more, let's say, intuitive, almost direct neurological engagement with the energy of a phenomena before you even know what it is. And so that's the kind of state that's very attractive to artists and creative individuals who, once entering into a greater sense of immediacy, can develop their own responses, their own stories, their own images, their own meaning to it. And so that's, to me, it starts with attention.
Do you see any outlet for the realization of something like that? I mean, you're doing it with your paratheatrical works and your film work. For other artists, like, this is my experience, going say in the Lower East Side in Manhattan at a gallery night. The work doesn't really seem to be engaging most people, and perhaps that's a bad example because those are social events. But I don't see a lot of people engaging with the work, and you've got speculators, investors in the background, even if they're not physically present, and it's very much dominated by a market mentality. But I don't see I don't know what kind of venue we could have today on a bigger scale that would allow people to participate as creators in the way Hakim Bey was saying. Like, for instance, the zines in the early 90s. I was very involved with that, not as a creator actually, but as a reader and correspondent and reviewer. And the zines now are done with a weird irony. Not to put them down, but it's because of the internet and what the changes that came with that. I don't know what culture we could have that would have that kind of opportunity.
Well, the thing is, I don't think it's wise to go back, try to replicate something that was happening in the 70s, 80s, or 90s, but to find a more honest response to where we are today. And you asked about an outlet and some kind of venue or some kind of thing where everybody can come into that experience. And I don't really see that as possible or realistic. What I'm talking about, attention, doesn't require any other outlet besides, walking outside and, if you can, for 30 seconds, see if you can relax the assignment of labels and meanings to what you're seeing around you. So it's really on a personal level. The outlet is your own attention. And if you can accomplish that, even for like a half a minute, to relax the assignment of meanings and labels and names and simply perceive what's before you and try to get a sense of what that might be without the projection of names, labels, and meanings, you've already had some kind of breakthrough into a sense of immediacy. It's already happened when that occurs. And, with consistent experimentation, half a minute turns into a minute turns into 5 minutes, and so forth, but it takes practice, and this is, again, a personal thing, and not everybody is going to be going to have availability to this. Not everybody is going to be able to access this second attention, but those who can or have the time and the diligence and the commitment to experiment have a much higher chance of doing that.
And that's related to the Eighth Circuit model of consciousness, which you've written about. Yeah,
well, the Eighth Circuit brain is a model that was made popular by Timothy Leary. He didn't actually originate it. It originated through an oral transmission that Leary received by this guy that was called Professor Adams during the mid-'60s at Millbrook, where Leary was, living in this mansion with, Richard Albert and, other early experimentation of psilocybin and so forth. And he received basically a very esoteric transmission of the Hindu chakra system that he then renamed as circuits rather than chakras, and then he developed certain theories of intelligence increase based on the tertiary function of the most basic unit of biological intelligence, which is the neuron, and the neuron's capacity to absorb, integrate, or store and transmit information and or energy became his definition for intelligence, your capacity for absorbing, integrating, and transmitting information or energy. And so he applied this through all 8 circuits, and each of the 8 circuits simply represents a different function of intelligence. And so the model forces the user to redefine intelligence, or at least be open to investigating alternative definitions of intelligence besides intellect and IQ. And so intellectual intelligence being one of the 8 circuits is circuit 3, intellectual. But there's physical, emotional, intellectual, social intelligence. Then we go into the upper circuit, somatic intelligence, wisdom of the body. And then we go into circuit 6, and that's where the second attention I was talking about occurs. And so we're really talking about the nervous system becoming aware of itself, the self-aware nervous system. And then it goes into even kind of further out into the 7th circuit, which he refers to as the genetic intelligence, or the mythopoetic intelligence of humanity, the genius of humanity, and so forth. And that ties into DNA, which of course manufactures nervous systems, which of course controls the physical body. So there's a little bit of a hierarchy there. And then finally, circuit 8, he refers to as quantum intelligence, or the intelligence represented by the in the heart of the atom, the singularity that quantum physicists and those guys study on a regular basis, what happens in the heart of the atom. The material there. What is that about? And so I've written a couple of books on the 8th circuit brain model. One called Angel Tech, that was published in 1985, I think it was. It's still in print at the original Falcon Press. And then in 2009, I updated the material after 25 years of experimentation. I've updated it into that book, and that book's called The 8th Circuit Brain, Navigational Strategies for the Energetic Body. And that's also still in print.
Let me say, again, if you want some information on Antero's work, you can check out verticalpool.com, P-O-O-L, and paratheatrical.com. Yeah, I have a lot of questions about that. Not so much the model, the 8th Circuit model itself, but, I read your book, Angel Tech, and I read Wilson's book on, what was that called?
Prometheus Rising.
Yeah, exactly. But that was also by Falcon, and I think Hyatt did the introduction to that.
Yeah.
Really, really fascinating books, and I made this series of, what Jack Chick tracks were?
Explain that.
They were little religious nuggets of bigotry and stupidity that you would put in a bathroom at a truck stop, or you'd put into where people are traveling and they go and they find brochures. You'd have these little. They're based on the old 8-pagers, the size of them from the 40s, little underground comics. But they're
right.
Okay, and they would tell you whom to hate and all types of, and who to fear. I made a version of those based on your work and based on Wilson's work, Leary's work, basically presenting exercises to get out of those traps that can occur at those circuits. And it's called The Young Philosopher's Guide to Reality. But it's just a bunch of cartoon silliness meant to be very serious and wake people up from those things.
Well, that's very imaginative, very cool.
Well,
good for you.
Thank you. I still, they will be available. But the point is that, I don't see, when I read your work or Leary's work or Wilson's work or listen to people from that era, I don't see that kind of very humane, human openness anymore. And I wonder what's going on culturally and politically that we, as a socially, don't seem to be able to experience those kind of open states. And maybe that's my delusion. I didn't experience the 70s as an adult, so maybe I'm projecting all of that. But it seemed that there were many more people who could suspend judgment about basic core elements of reality. I mean, now we're fighting with each other about things like white supremacism that I thought were long gone.
Well, I think there's a trend in the culture towards psychopathology.
Yes, that's where I'm at.
And my friend and mentor Christopher S. Hyatt wrote this book called The Psychopath's Bible.
Right. I haven't read that.
And it's a dangerous book because Hyatt is a clinical psychiatrist. His research has been on monkey brains, and his lifelong, research project has been the study of the psychopath. He's basically something of a psychopath himself, or he was, but he became his version of the psychopath. But he was he understood what the psychopath was, and he also understood that there was many young individuals, sort of like Jordan Peterson, usually young male men in their 20s and 30s, that were in the process of becoming accidental psychopaths. Meaning, they weren't being psychopaths on purpose, but
sure,
because of the culture at large and the influence and the lack of, let's say, fathers or lack of a strong male figure and so forth, that they were moving towards an area in their own psychology that lacked conscience or lacked the development of true conscience. And this is at the very basis of psychopathology, is the lack of conscience. And the development of conscience takes a lot of work. It's like a little bit like the Christian illusion that everybody is born with a soul. And that's not something I personally buy into. To me, this thing called soul, this ineffable presence of soul, really has to be earned and made throughout the lifetime in the process of soul making, in the way that you live, what you choose to believe in, how you connect and relate with the world, how you endure suffering, how you transform your suffering into something creative, how you nurture the imagination. All of these are soul-making processes. And so when that's missing, when a person skips out on the soul-making process, they also skip out on the development of conscience. And to me, conscience starts with consciousness expansion. As you find ways to expand your consciousness, you naturally begin perceiving more reality, and as you perceive more reality, you have the opportunity to start knowing a little bit more about what you actually care about and what you don't care about. And this is, I think, the birth of conscience, is this development of the awareness and the emotional investment, really, in what you actually care about or what is worth caring about. And so this is something that I think that is, lacking, is that people are just stopping. They're not caring as much. The spirit of what is it that you care most about. This is. I think this is what you may be talking about. Kind of a heartlessness.
Yeah, I'm wondering, and what you said about the creation of a soul, whatever we want to call soul, which is I don't go along the traditional religious routes, but there was a psychologist named James Hillman who.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and he said, I thought this was brilliant. I read this as a very young man, and it changed my perception. But he said, we create the soul, and we do this by spending time with art, which was one of his main pushes. That, when you're going and you're looking at a painting for hours, and you're coming back to that, you're intensifying and complexifying this internal landscape. And what I wonder is, because of the destruction of our environment and the destruction really of our economic well-being too, if there's this simultaneous push or maybe a foundational push behind it to destroy imaginative possibility and to destroy that ability to have an interior landscape.
Well, of course there is, but there's also, this is part of the very human instinct for fighting and battle. And so we have the enemy. We have an awareness of the enemy, or we basically have the awareness of something that's trying to kill me.
Right.
And so what is it within myself that is willing to fight for my imagination, to fight for my soul? And this fighting instinct, I think, is a very important one, but often misdirected when people lose track of what is actually worth fighting for, And when they lose track of what's worth fighting for, they pretty much start fighting against whatever is rubbing against their meaningless egos.
That's an important point. Yeah, I see that, and I see, without the ability to connect into yourself physically and to that personal unconscious, you're filled with appropriate targets for that.
Yeah. I mean, we're all in many ways victims. We're all in many ways persecutors. We're all in many ways saviors. It's kind of a trinity sometimes I look at: persecutor, savior, victim. And if you can get some kind of understanding of, where you are on all those 3 points, and you can come into some, I think, better awareness of the persecutors, victims, and saviors of the world around you.
Right.
So, this is part of, I think, what you're talking about is basically finding more clarity around the internal references within your own system, within your own nervous system, within your own subconscious, of certain things that are happening in the world. Well, I think they're happening first in yourself. And then if you can, expose yourself to yourself, different dimensions and aspects of your own nature, I think it's a lot easier to get along with the world, quite frankly.
That's an important point. Yes, we're almost out of time. I was saying before we began, I have an hour here, and it's a nice little chunk, but there's so much more we could talk about. The stuff you're bringing up right now, for instance, I see, such a continuum between, the moment when Francis Fukuyama says, like, we've come to the end of history and we've achieved this, and the deadening of the political imagination there, with the attacks, the war on drugs that limit people's ability to have an easy psychedelic button to push to get that moment of lack of labeling, to the attacks on the arts and the limiting there, and the proliferation of these screens and surveillance and such that also limits us and forces us to, almost in definitely Orwellian sense, to hide what could be an expression of something we've discovered about ourselves.
Well, let's raise a glass to post-history.
Yeah, exactly. Well, is there anything you're working on right now that you want to point people to specifically? Again, verticalpool.com and paratheatrical.com are places you can go to learn more about Antero's work. Is there anything specific you're working on that we should be aware of?
That's a good question. I'm researching a film right now, but the muses are telling me not to talk about it. I don't argue with the muses, so I'm kind of hush-hush about that.
That's why.
Let's see. 2 times a year, I offer an interactive online course of study in the Eighth Circuit brain, and also another one in interpreting your own astrology chart from my particular angle or approach to the language. And you can find information on that by going to verticalpool.com. And there's quite a bit of information on the paratheater work, including videos of performances. This is not just a private internal process. We have, over the years, also produced numerous video documents of various performances, and also various kind of non-performance research studies on dreams, for example, finding ritual choreographies of movements recalled from dreams that then, when enacted, stimulate the imagination of the dream body while awake, while physically moving and, aware of your environment.
Yeah, that's fascinating work. I encourage anyone listening, this will go up online as well. This is live right now, but anyone listening today, right now, or later, to investigate Antero's work. It's fascinating, a part of a tradition of an open-ended, artistic, very vital approach that is very hard to find today. And may we have you on again, or may I should say?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. You're a delight to chat with. I like chatting with you.
Well, I really appreciate it. And, as I mentioned to a couple of people before this, you're in line with, I don't really have heroes or idols, but in terms of people that paved a path you're in line with that, as is Wilson, or was Wilson, and other people who, they don't really fit into a genre, and maybe they're a philosopher, maybe they're a magician, maybe they're a painter, maybe they're a director, a choreographer.
Yeah, sticks and stones.
Excellent. Antero, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and you enjoy your day early on out in Oregon right now.
Thank you very much.
All right, appreciate it. This was The Other Future. You were listening to me, Terry Tapp, your host. My guest this week was Antero Alli, and you can find more information about him at paratheoretical.com, as well as verticalpool, POOL.com.